Well, hey there, everybody. We're super excited that we have Cyber Matt Lee joining for our cybersecurity webinar today. We have almost 100 people signed up. I know some folks, we are recording this, so you'll get the recording later. And can't wait. Matt is so passionate about his mission to raise the tide about cybersecurity, so I'm real excited to see what he has to say. Nancy?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking my phone calls and responding to my emails and signing up with Matt. Like Ann said, we have close to 100 today, so we're really excited about that. All righty, take it away, Matt. We're ready to hear from you.
Yeah, awesome. So first, you'll notice that I am having to make my camera be my screen share. I apologize for that. I'm having some technical difficulties with GoToWebinar, as we've all had our experiences in life. So here I find myself. So give me a little bit of grace in that regard. I'll give you my background. I was an MSP just like Ann and her team there. And I started out when it was just 7 of us and grew it to over $40 million in revenue, MSP serving about 20,000 endpoints across 5 states in the
Wow.
US. And I was their director of security and compliance. And ultimately, we bought an MSP that I now call Voldemort. And that is because they were compromised by a ransomware gang called Soda no Kibi, or Evil. And I spent the next 18 months of my life with the FBI and working with lawsuits and things that come from that nature. And so it's always nice and refreshing when I meet somebody, that is doing this well, like, Ann and Nancy and team. And so I just wanted to come and share some of my thoughts of essentially what's going on in the world. So if there's any questions, please ask them. We'll have some time at the end for questions. We can make it a lot more enriched if you do ask questions. Even if you just want to poke fun at me, that's fine too, right? So I'd love to have a good conversation. So
You're a good
yeah,
sport.
thanks for having me. Do you want me to just get started with kind of my presentation then, Ann?
Yeah, why don't
Sure.
you dive in, and then we'll be joining you on video at the end with some questions. So
Awesome. Let's
take it
make sure
away,
everybody
Matt.
can see this first. Can y'all see my screen and it comes up with a slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. So you don't see me any longer, but I promise you I'm still here. I'm not a cat. So we'll start with that. Yeah, so let's talk about cybersecurity, right? Who am I? We've already talked about this. These are some of my letters. I kind of rotate them and choose which one that I want to present each year, but I'll briefly go through them. My CISSP is essentially a master's degree in broad domains, 8 different domains of cybersecurity. CCSP is more cloud focused. CCSK is super cloud focused. CFR is the cybersecurity forensics first responder, which is really more about incident response. And then PNPT, I'm proud of the most because it was a 5-day exam that I passed last December, where I got to break into a network and confirm that I could take complete access of it. So it was a fantastic exam, but that's some of my credentials. I work for Pax8, which is an amazing distributor that Ann's partners with. And we are a distributor who tries to bring value and teach and educate and drive forward the security and compliance capabilities of MSPs, and I spend most of my time with amazing MSPs doing this. So thank you. All right, so today's threats. Let's kind of talk about what faces most SMBs in the world from a threat perspective. I'm just going to kind of highlight over some of them, but this is really just kind of the beginning of it. It's not meant out of the sense of fear and uncertainty and doubt. We do have things we can do. We understand how to reduce the threats and reduce our risk as a result of that. So just to visualize this, one of the things that I like to do is look at data. And so this comes from Data is Beautiful. You can go look this up, Data is Beautiful breach records. And it really shows all of the records that have been compromised in the largest breaches at that time. Now, what is a breach? That is when, and if you take anything away from this, never say the word breach unless your attorney or your incident response team says this was a breach. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but most principally, it's the legal implications of saying I had a breach. Once you've said that, you have effectively had a breach. So, and you may have to pay for credit monitoring, breach notification rules, potential lawsuits, things in that nature, depending on privacy and what the breach was. So ultimately, this is 2011 from 2008. This is the visual map. If you feel like cybersecurity's kind of just crept up on you, it's because it has. If you look at that same map from 2019 to 2022, it's a significantly drastic different picture, isn't it? We've seen this grow massively, and it's not just small businesses, it's not just mid-sized enterprise, it's everyone, it's government. Everybody's facing this challenge. And so we really start talking about this and hearing about it more, and you're hearing it on your insurance apps, you're hearing it on all sorts of things. And that's mainly because it's become such an issue. It's endemic. In fact, how large would you say it is? Well, let's ask the first question. Why me? Why would anyone want to bother me? I'm just a small business, right? But that's the problem. Just like anything in racketeering back in the 50s, criminal acts typically involving extortion that involve a scheme to organize to extract illegal profits. And there's tons of ways it's done. And it hasn't changed over the history of time. It's just evolved into the next way that that is going to happen. In the 1950s, it had been, boy, sure wish you would pay me $5,000 protection so your house doesn't burn down, eh? Right? That then turned into what we see today. So let's talk about one of the first ones of those. The economy of cybercrime, before we get into that, actually, sorry, I'm getting my slides out of order, but the economy of cybercrime is not just a hacker in a hoodie in the basement. It's not just some unorganized thing. There's many components to it. If we looked at it from an economic perspective, back in February, a gentleman, Justinus, wrote, cybercrime is the world's third largest economy thanks to a booming black market. And this was actually validated data from several cybersecurity researchers, but basically saying that cybercrime is the third largest economy in the entire world, and it's projected to be bigger and be in the second position over China. Now, they're not showing projection of China's growth, but that aside, the point being that it is growing, and it's growing on the backs of small to mid-sized business. If you look at our economy, does anybody in their mind have an idea of what percentage the small to mid-sized business market makes up of our GDP? It's like 42%. So even though there's tons and tons of them, it's highly distributed, it's really essentially working at a, 42% of the overall GDP of the United States is in small to mid-sized business. So it's in your hands. And so when you ask why would someone attack little old me, the reason would principally be because that's where the money is, right? It's similar to the cybercrime conversation. Let's talk about what goes into some of this economy, right? We think they're unsophisticated. Nope. There are people that do the remote access, right? That's the person that's going to say, hey, I found some credentials for Sally at this company. Sally's company seems like they do this, or Bob, I don't want to be discriminative, right? Initial access brokerage. They're the people that go in and break in first. That's where I trick you into clicking something. You do what I need you to do, and I have access. But I may not be the person that ultimately extracts the money from you. I may go on and say, hey, anybody want to go do a ransomware gig at this one company? I totally just got them. I need to sell this $500. Well, they'll go do a ransom of 10,000 to a million. So you see that this is essentially an economy. What isn't even shown here is afterwards they have systems to wash the money, right? To make it to where they can hide where the proceeds came from. So the point is this is a very large economy that's actually against us. They're just like you. They want to run a business. And what are businesses run for? There's a famous CISO, her name's Alyssa Miller, and she says, we're told all our lives in security that security is a conversation about risk and that the language of business is risk. And she said it's not true. The language of business is profit. Risk is inherent when you start business. You just don't understand it sometimes and you don't know how to manage it. So just trying to understand that this is a sophisticated aspect on the other side. So how do they extract the money today? Everybody in the audience has probably heard of ransomware. We don't have to beat that to death. Ransomware is essentially running something to cryptographically take your machines and your assets and your ability to function away from you, where you have to unlock it with a key, and they have the key. And so they ask you to pay. Well, in ransomware initially, it probably wouldn't have been a breach usually, as long as no illicit data was accessed or if it was accessed from some third-party means. So ultimately, ransomware was fine until they had people with good backups. Well, Anne and team have great backups, and so they're going to be able to restore. So that's when they started the next method, which is called double extortion. Double extortion at its basic is saying we're going to take the first path of ransomware. We're definitely going to do those things. But before we write the data and all encrypted, we're going to go ahead and extract some of the data so that we can use it for our purposes. What purposes might that be? Well, it makes it a breach because they now have touched data in that regard. But also, they find ways to make you pay. A common incident that happened a couple of times now has been they take a therapist office, for example, with medical records, but also kind of sensitive, mental records. And they say, hey, if you don't pay, even though you got backups, we're now going to send this out to everybody on this person's contact list, your patient, with all their notes about the husband and the things they're dealing with and all the So you pay, right? And so double extortion is a methodology to make you pay. Well, how do you defend against that? The goal is to limit the blast radius, to treat your sensitive data sensitively and manage it in ways that you can protect it better, right? Ultimately. So another methodology we're seeing is business email compromises. And these are rough and they come from kind of a change that's happened in the US. We should pat ourselves on the back. As an international community and as the United States Department of Justice, we have gotten pretty good at getting back at some of these ransomware operators, the people doing double extortion. So huzzah, we actually have a win, right? So we are seeing that we're starting to win. Well, the challenge is just like everything that's ever happened when we stopped people burning down buildings, when we stopped people robbing banks, they just shifted how they extracted cash, right? Essentially. And so business email compromises are a great example of this. And I'll give a quick example of what this means. A BEC says, I break into company A's email server and I realized that company B owes company A $500,000. Company A that is now compromised, they set up another domain similar to their domain, right? Let's say if it was Iron Scales, it'll be elronscales.com because the L looks like an I. And so they set up another domain, they copy an email out, they then forward that invoice off to company B and say, hey, we need to change our wire instructions. Would you please change your ACH and routing number to this? Which is just an account set up by the threat actor. And the threat actor then does the same thing to company B and then to company C, and they keep discovering down the chain that path. And I've seen one be $1.9 million in cash flow because company B paid A 500,000. They then were demanded by company A another 500,000. They weren't getting their grain shipment. They then had company C, one of their downstreams, get popped because of company B being compromised. They didn't have MFA and they didn't have phishing resistant MFA. And they ultimately then had the same thing happen to company C. And so they lost another 900,000, which if you're playing at home, kids, that's 500, 500, and 900 from a cash flow perspective, which is $1.9 million. So ultimately, those things are crippling for some businesses. And so that the threat actors have gotten so good at the ACHs that they know how to evade ACH clawback provisions. They know the timelines. They know when to do it. They understand international wires. They understand all those things. So ultimately, I think, yeah, business email compromise was the next big shift. How do we combat against that? It's having good phishing resistant and MFA on your systems, and having the Microsoft Hero SKU, the business premium or above, and driving things forward in that way, and other compensating methods that Ann and team have in place probably. But the point being, BECs are kind of rough. That goes into the ACH wire fraud, which we kind of discussed in the business email compromise conversation. And then the last one I want to get on your radar is really cloud abuse. And it follows the same prescriptive advice for business email compromise. The threat actors are finding that some of the abilities of banks are requiring physical walk-ins for wires and physical change controls, and businesses are getting better at implementing administrative controls. So the other things they're finding to extract cash is by simply using your access to Microsoft or AWS or Google Compute or any of those resources that you have if you're using one of the major platforms, and spin up Azure resources, right? Spin up actual compute resources, machines, virtual machines running in the cloud. And some of these machines have certain graphics cards that are used for science, for AI, for things like that, that run about $1,000 a minute. And so they spin up these $1,000 a minute machines. The big problem is most cloud systems report monthly, which means you have 30 days of this running before you discover it. And I've seen those bills be hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. So I just want to keep this on your radar that if you have an administrative account that can spin up new resources, or an account that can, actually do those kind of things from that perspective and can generate or ask for things in the cloud, you want to make sure you protect them really well, right? That's a big thing. So we've talked about some of the threats. They are creating some risks, and I do like to talk about risk because it does matter to the SMB. And they may not be the ones you think of. It's really insurability is the principal one. So I don't know if there's any insurance people in the crowd. I will say that I have been a licensed insurance broker in my life, in a former part of my life. And I would say that insurance is essentially a very good form of organized gambling, right? In the sense that if I'm fat and have high blood pressure, they can fairly well predict how I'm going to pass away, at least from a time perspective and overall raw numbers perspective. They have good actuarial data, which means that they can separate life insurance for someone like me at my age, at my current life proclivities, at things that they can understand, into a way to say you're in a class of insurance. And in this class of insurance, we know that we have X dollars to return. This is your premium cost, right? Like this is the way they were able to do it. The problem for us is that we're now starting to see the cost of cyber incidents rise drastically. We're seeing small to mid-sized businesses be, kind of having to deal with this, depending on the vertical you're in, and also, state and locality. But the point being, insurability is getting really tough. I don't know if any of you have cyber insurance. I hope you do. But if you filled out a form 4 years ago, before travelers fired the shot that was heard around the world in 2021, you would have absolutely just checked a box and gotten insurance. Right? That's it. There's no actuarial separation. It just said, here's your limits for the policy, and here you go, you have it. It might have even been just a rider. But now, if you fast forward and if you're looking for insurability today, there's a 17-page questionnaire. I think, we've gathered 30 or 40 applications or so amongst friends. And, some of them are massive and some of them are very, very pointed. And they ask questions that I don't even think the insurance company well understands. But even as you see that, you're drifting towards the insurance companies follow standards and frameworks and start to ask questions that are more common between them. So you're seeing that growth. And so if you are going to maintain insurability, you will find it harder and harder to have a poor security posture while asking for insurability. And the reason for that is you can't just hand off all risk in a one-to-one ratio. The things you can do with risk are essentially you can mitigate risk in some forms by taking actions like adding security capabilities or leaning in. You can do things to avoid risk. You can say, well, I'm not going to do that. I won't, if I'm an ice cream stand, maybe I don't need Sally's social security number before I sell ice cream to her, right? Like it doesn't make sense. Maybe I won't grab that. I'll avoid that risk of having that social or some date of birth or some identifying information in certain states. But then you can also transfer, right? You can accept. You can say, well, I accept this risk. Or you can transfer risk and say, I'll buy insurance for some of this risk, right? I'll offset $2 million of this risk that I can't afford. But when you think about it, if the insurance company says no, then you have accepted that risk. And then if it comes to bear, you will find yourself having to deal with that. So that's kind of the point. That's one of the big risks that's coming from these extensible threats. The other piece that hasn't come to fruition today yet, but has been something that's been talked about, it's been predicted, and at the end of the day is banking. When you think about it, currently banks take the biggest risk. If you accept the risk and the bank has a loan for you, and you do not realize the size of that risk, and you cannot pay back said loan, even the personal guarantor that the bank has taken for that is often going to be impacted, especially in small to mid-sized business. That's the lifeblood of the income that drives our force forward. So banking is going to certainly come to fruition where just having a healthy plan, and you talk about that, what can we do? How can I have a healthy plan? How can I be reasonable? So one more thing that comes to play that I want to get on your radar before we answer that how can I be reasonable question is some of this is not your fault. Some of this, in fact, the grand majority of this is due to just the nature of capitalism. And I love me some capitalism, don't get me wrong. I very much enjoyed selling my company when we sold for 40 million a few years ago. But at the end of the day, it's insecure by default. And what I mean by this is I have this middle theory that's kind of a restating of capitalism and its endeavors from a product perspective that says, ultimately, we always fall to whatever the maturity of our consumer is as the level where we stop growing, right? If my maturity of my consumer is buying my product at the prices and margins I want, there's nothing to drive us forward and be better at said product or service, right? And every product comes to some stasis in that at some point. But ultimately, if you think about it, there's industries where we've seen this insecure by default theme come up before. Let's talk about these dates. Anybody playing in the audience, I don't have the benefit of speaking with you directly as I would in a normal presentation, so I apologize. But can anybody think about what these dates might be? 1885 to 1950, like that's a long time. That's like 65 years based on my count. To 1965 to 1966, what is that? I'll let you ponder for a second. Okay, first car, 1885 by Benz. 1950, seatbelts. First time there was a lap belt, 1950. 1965, Ralph Nader wrote Unsafe at Any Speed. And in this book, he talks about how the auto industry, every car is unsafe. And I won't get into it. I'm being super summative. But the point is, it was a pinnacle of the unrest of this safety of a product not being good at saving lives and killing people. And after that, I think, in fact, in 1965, I think there was a vehicle that had a spike in the air at each of the air vents that if you maybe hit that on impact of a car, it might impale oneself, right? And so it was a cool design. It looked rocket shippy, but there was no thought into it. And we build technology first before we make it safe. 1966, the first National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966. But if you think about it, if you walked outside and got in a car today, you would not have to first go in and turn on the airbags before you decided to drive. You would not have to first make sure that the fuel wasn't stored in a way that if you got tapped in the bumper, I'm looking at you, Pinto, right? And also Fire Arrow. Everybody forgets about the Fiero. But both of those would kill you because there's no safety. You could put it right over the exhaust. They didn't care. There was no design check. There was no safety testing. But now they ram them into a wall at 40 miles an hour and see if it lights on fire. Now they check that the engine runs underneath the components of the car and keeps the passenger shell in somewhat of an egg-shaped form where it's not going to be destroyed. Right? You have that kind of thought that would never have existed if the consumer wasn't demanding it and if at some point we didn't have some form of regulatory oversight. But at that point, it was 81 years. That was 81 years of a technology before we started to decide maybe we should try to protect the passengers of these things. They're getting pretty quick. They're really a problem. Well, let's take that same thought process into another corollary. What do these dates mean? 1937, 1983, 1989, 2018, and 2023. If anybody gets these, love to have a chat. You're probably somebody that's as nerdy about this stuff as I am. But 1937 is when the first digital computer technically existed, right? And we saw a similar gap in time before we started having this growth of the product. And maybe we saw cars get faster as these times went on, but this is when the internet happened. Jan 1, 1983, ARPANET went live. 1989, we actually had the first ransomware type incident, which was AIDS Trojan horse virus that was demanding payment for the removal of said, right? It's the same exact kind of play out as we see this kind of shift. And in 2018, we first have our national cybersecurity strategy by the United States of America that was put out that started to say, hey, we need to come up with the pillars of how we solve this. We can't hemorrhage $7 trillion from the global economy to threat actors that are just playing out of their garage for 50 bucks or in a sophisticated call center for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars an hour that they're earning. Right. And we think about this now, it was finally updated in 2023. And I want to dig into this just for one case. And I want to go back to saying, some of this is not your fault. And the reason I say that, maybe if my slide will advance, there we go, is strategic objective 3.3. Now, this went into pillars. This was one of the strategic objectives that says shift liability for insecure software and products and services. They're basically saying that companies make money by not making things more safe at the cost of profit. And I know it's hard to believe, but it happens. And ultimately what they're saying is secure by design and secure by default. And what they mean by that is similar to what I had with a Microsoft conversation. Microsoft came to me when I was at an engineering airlift, and one of the heads product of identity said, Matt, we noticed that indirect providers like Pax8, all of their MSPs and customers really only have about 29% MFA installed and strong MFA. Why is that? Can I help teach you? Can I make you smarter? Can I help those poor MSPs? Can I help? And I turned it around and said, why is it not on by default and let the consumer be forced to turn it off? And she said, we could never do that. It would absolutely be devastating to us. We'd have competition. And this is really starting to set the stage that you can't buy a car without the seatbelt dinging at you. At some point, you can turn off the ding. There's a lot of ways in most cars to do it, but that's at the consumer's choice. And it's really saying, don't set me up for failure first. So I will say that's one of the big positives that is shifting is you'll start seeing more and more of this secure by design principle conversation come into play. So what should I do? I promised you I'd answer that question at the end of it. As a teacher, I have to add a couple more concepts to be able to answer that. But one of those is that right now in our world, we do not have a lot of legal precedent around cybersecurity. A lot of it's just now getting established. And one great example of that was last year, Travelers Insurance sued a company after they had paid them out. I think it was like a $3 million policy, but after they'd paid them out some unknown number in that $3 million policy 2 years before in 2021, in 2022, it was 2022, so that would have been 2020. But in 2022, they sued for rescission. Now, insurance companies have always had what's called subrogation or subrogable rights, which means they can say, this goes to that answer of, well, my client would never sue me. They're my best friend. If they have insurance and cyber insurance pays out on their behalf, they absolutely will. And the subrogable rights say, hey, as an insurer, I have the right to be you to sue on behalf of the money that I paid out to try to recoup it from the parties that were responsible, right? So you get into that. Think about like a car. If you get in a car wreck, typically in a no-fault state, your insurance pays, their insurance pays, and they figure it out later. They don't often go to court, but they figure it out in a kind of, if you will, spy trade. I'll take this one, you take that one kind of model. But ultimately, when you think about this, it means that your job right now, if there isn't a lot of precedence, is just to meet defensibility and reasonability. And we'll talk about kind of those two. Defensibility comes to this concept when I talk to everyone is as an MSP about this. And let me just check where I get from this here in a minute. We'll talk about it a little more here in a minute. But defensibility is really just saying, do I meet the reasonable person rule, right? When I talk about defensibility, I tell people, hey, as an MSP, your job is not to protect your client's network. And they kind of go in shock and act like I said something crazy, because I did. And then I finish with, your job is to be defensible in how you chose to do so, in the choices you made, in the ways you communicated with your clients, in the ways you got their buy-in or did not get their buy-in, and the tools you choose, and all those things, you need to be defensible. And as an MSP or as an SMB, that statement still applies. You need to be able to say, I was defensible in the way I chose to run my business. I understood the risk. I took actions to meet due care. These are all kind of concepts in the CISSP, but are also part of the growing legal conversation around this of meeting due care and reasonability. Well, what is reasonability? Reasonability is this understanding that if I put you and 12 of my friends over there and showed you what I did, would you find me being reasonable in my actions? Like, would you have taken massively different actions as a result of the data in front of you? If you had this many choices, this many dollars, this many problems, was I being reasonable? Well, how do you build reasonability? And it comes from this conversation of like, don't shoot from the hip. Don't just say, I bought the next security tool. I did the next thing. I thought this was the greatest next thing, as we've done. And I've done that in my career as I grew. And it really is this understanding of what's more reasonable. If I come to you and say, well, why did you use SentinelOne? Or why did you use this endpoint product? Or why did you use this piece? Why did you use this? And the answer is, wow, it's that new coolest thing. All my friends were talking about it. I had a couple of beers at the bar with this guy and he told me it was the best. So I put it on my products and it was great. Or would you rather hear a defensible answer that's more reasonable, such as, well, if you follow frameworks like CIS 10.1 says that I must have a malware prevention tool. 10.2 goes on to say it needs to be centrally managed. It needs to be automatically updated in 10.2 and 10.3. And then this was the comparison, which is reasonable. It's reasonable to come from some body of evidence and something like a framework. Well, what is a framework? A framework's nothing more than this. Stove hot, don't touch stove, right? We've all learned it as kids, or at least I learned it a couple times because I'm apparently stupid. But the point is, we know that. We learn it. It's something we know when we teach. It's part of our teaching elements as parents as we grow. If stove hot, don't hurt yourself, right? But ultimately in cybersecurity, it's also the same from that regard. We're talking about simple prescriptive things. We're talking about 5.6 that says use single sign-on, and 6.3 and 4 and 2 that say use MFA, right? And 6.7 that says centralized access control, things that Ann and team understand and can implement as time goes, and you understand this growth of capability. And they've already been doing a lot of these things for you. There's things that we have on the CIS framework where her team goes, yeah, we've already been updating stuff, of course. But it gives you a way to be reasonable about what you've done. You followed these simple prescriptive things. What more could I have done? I followed a body of knowledge that's already on version 8, these type of things. When we talk about frameworks, it's also helpful to understand what a framework focuses on. We talk about protection. If you hear in the news, or if you look at a product ad, or if you're walking through the airport and you see Barracuda protects you from all, SentinelOne's the best, all of those things, they're all true. They do products. They're great for what they do. And you have to have tools. In the same way that if I'm a surgeon and I have scalpels, I'm probably going to be successful. But let's not lie, it's not the scalpels that makes the surgery, right? It's ultimately the surgeon, the MSP, the partner, the internal tech, whatever it may be. But let's talk about why this matters and why we only talk about protect. And it's because as a human, we really just want to know that we're protected. It's one of those early pieces in this Maslow's hierarchy of needs understanding. But yet let's talk about this in the way it should be, which is we have to identify first, comma, space, know thyself. What are my assets? What machines do I sign in from? How do I sign in? What are my software assets? What do I use? Where's my data? What's the sensitivity of my data? How is it protected? How's it backed up? How can I function without it? What parts are important? That's identify. Only then can you protect and drive forward in understanding what you're actually protecting. Here's the data. Here's the juicy bits. Here's the places of weakness. Then I can detect. We talk about this. If you've done the math so far, there's 5 of these that you see in the wheel. The first 2 are identify and protect. That's what we all think about is protection. We often forget about the identification, but let's just say we always think about the protection. But more impact is made in a cyber event by how well you detect the threat actor, who got in, what got in, how did it get past this armor, because it's going to happen. Why is it going to happen? Because 3/5 are after the explosion. They are after that. Detection is meaning something has happened. We want to find it faster, limit its damage, keep it from doing something if we can. That's why those tools exist. But then after that, it's whoever responds better, right? The better I can respond and actually stop it and respond and get back to work, and how well I recover are going to be the most impactful aspects of that. And when we get into response, sometimes it means you have to actually mount a response. You may not know that the threat actor we stopped was really not stopped. And it really comes down to having some of that capability and nuance. But the point I'm trying to bring up is a framework follows this understanding of teaching and guiding actions that enable each of those categories. What frameworks make the most sense to small to mid-sized business? I would say there's 2. It's really NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, which is a quasi-government scientist think tank that sets standards for lots of things. One of the interesting things about NIST, it is so great, is the people that do these guides for cybersecurity for us also make the atomic clock work. And I'm being a little facetious, but the point is it's very scientific. Right? NIST is an extremely scientific approach to things, and it often gives these grandiose do this, but not a lot of guidance sometimes into how to do this or where to do this or what to do with this. And so I like to say that CIS, which is actually the Center for Internet Security, it's a US based, lots of former No Such Agency exit members that are keeping up with the standards of what we should do to protect ourselves as a baseline in this country. And they separate them into 3 groups: implementation group 1, group 2, and group 3, which are escalatory. And so the more business risk or the more sophisticated or the more intellectual property or the more, you go on, you move up the scale and do IG2 and IG3. And so it's set up in a very prescriptive way to help meet NIST. And so my point is I like to think of CIS as the how to NIST's what. NIST comes out and says, do this. CIS is, here's how you should do this. Here's a good poke at it. And that's really kind of it, is if you have an internal security person, if you're working with an MSP like Ann and her team, then lean into that conversation. And the reason for this is security can't be done in a vacuum. You have to be a partner. You have to be willing to understand when sometimes even your software that you're using is a limitation and will create risk for you. And you may have to consider, what does the 3-year plan look like? How do we move towards what is right? And kind of that's kind of the end of this from a presentation perspective, but I would certainly welcome questions, and I'll bring my fake pseudo cam back up over here. But here we are. So, Anne, if you want to come on back.
Yeah, that was great. I jotted down a whole bunch of notes, Matt.
I did too.
So yeah, totally love that. And I have to get I'm going to just see if I can do this super fast. I got to get the obligatory selfie with Matt and Nancy there. Smile.
That's fair. I do a few of those.
Yeah, I think the topic of insurability. So I was kind of, as you were saying that, I kind of got that stress level going because we just got our own questionnaire.
Man.
And, we help a lot of clients go through, like, decipher what the questions are, because folks have to answer this for their own business. But these just keep getting long. Like, where is that going? They're just getting longer and longer and more and more complicated.
Great question. Okay, awesome. So it's going a lot of ways. What you're seeing play out in insurance in the general market wants to see a premium return number that's probably somewhere on the dollar to dollar, where if they bring in $1 premium, they don't want to pay out more than 50 cents, right? They want to make, a healthy profit margin in that regard. Mm-hmm. And there's better numbers out there. But the point is the loss ratios are growing and growing, and they are paying out. Like a lot of people say, oh, they're not paying. No, that's not really true. They're paying out, but they're starting to claw back, right? They're starting to take the money back when appropriate. So much so that I work with a lot of incident response teams, and they're being asked to gather evidence that the MSP or the client partner didn't follow something they said they did in their form. So on the short term, I think you'll start seeing more rejections of claims. I think you'll start seeing, for cause, you're starting to see even the policy application become a rider to the coverage, meaning that if there is a material
Hmm.
omission or change in that, then the coverage was already found to have been non-existent, right? So you don't have to deal with this rescission lawsuit aspect of it. Like I said, and I didn't finish that earlier, you're right. They sued for rescission. Ultimately, they settled out of court for that rescission claim in the plaintiff's favor. So they did return the policy, and you can principally understand that they did not go to court, so they didn't drag that company's security policy through open and public forums, right? And so they opted to hand
Yeah.
back the money. And so ultimately, though, where is insurance going? There's a number of projects that I'm involved in some, and there's a lot that I'm not involved in, obviously, but where we're taking products and services that you use and mapping them to CIS, right? So I'm working with 40 vendors on about 100 and so products right now
Hmm.
to take and go very deeply into the 153 safeguards within CIS and say, does this product or service help serve that or not, right? Can it help them do this? Which means then when we can see what's installed, you can actually see a holistic map against a larger percentage of body of calculation of what that risk looks like. Maybe they're weak in response, or they're weak in defense capabilities from a protection perspective, like that kind of mathematical understanding. But you're starting to see it go even deeper, right? Like insurance companies are even starting to say, if you'll use this stack, my stuff, then we'll give you better insurance. Or if you'll let me put this little agent that lets me easily prove you weren't following the rules, I mean, check on your posture, I'll give you a better price. And so you're starting to see even privacy considerations come up from that. What kind of data do they have access to? Do they become their own supply chain risk? But short story is the insurance companies are at least starting to align with CIS and frameworks. It was funny. I was in a airplane the other day, and there was two guys sitting in front of me, and they were talking about stuff that gets my nerd juices going, right? Like they were talking about, identity and OAuth as an extensibility versus SAML and what its risk difference was. And I was like, these must be cyber people. These are my peoples in front of me, right? And I reached up and I was like, hey, just if you don't mind me asking, what do you guys do? Oh, we're insurance adjusters. What? And it was just,
Wow.
it dawned on me, they started hiring the us's of the world to start
Yeah.
understanding that. If you look at it, Wes Spencer, another prominent influencer in cybersecurity, like what I do, was just at Fifth Wall and as an advisor and a board member at an insurance company. You see that playing out over and over. So there's a lot of data projects going where they're trying to separate classes of insureds by at least, do they have an EDR? Do they not? Do they have an MSP that's helping them? If so, what are they doing? Like you're starting to see that. So the price always normalizes and you start seeing it come back. Right now, you're just going to see escalating rates or declined
Yeah.
coverages. We did see a little brief positive, we think, last year, but I think it's already now pivoted to not. But end of last year and first quarter this year, we actually saw through Coveware, which is a ransomware negotiation firm, a drop in ransom payments. And you have a couple of reasons that could be, but some of it may be the spear tip of global war and things that are distracting of those ransomware operators right now
Yeah.
from your
They're working
perspective.
on other things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, they're dealing with some other things. But also it's a payments are lower. You're starting to see exclusions for how much a first party payment can be. You're starting to see co-insurance play out in insurance from a cyber perspective. So
Yeah.
there's
And
just
there's
a lot of change in that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
the federal regulations around paying criminals. Uh, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
we hired a incident response team to work with us recently, and it's an
good.
eye-opening experience to go through different scenarios
Yeah.
of things that could happen. So we're internally working a lot on that. I love the graphic that you had of the guy with the T-shirt "I Heart Crime" because it's
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah.
I borrowed that from somebody else that made it, I'm sure. But
Yeah,
yes.
and then in terms of what folks can do, one of the things I love that you post online is all the. I think you're up to like number 23 of laptops that are just left
Yeah. I
unlocked.
think I think I'm actually only at 14 this year, but I think I got
Oh,
40 last year. And that's a
yeah,
great call out, right? Why does that matter? I'll give you the quick why. So I have a little USB device that I carry around called a Bash Bunny. And that bash bunny I can plug in, it becomes a keyboard. It's an HID, or human interface device. And so your computer doesn't have the ability to reject it no more than it can reject a keyboard, unless you have set up very, very hard things to manage to do that make it very hard to function. And so that keyboard only functions when your computer's unlocked. But if I find an unlocked one, I can plug that in and do whatever I want in about 3 seconds, and then pull that back out and maintain access to that machine, bypass security capabilities, reach out and create a netcat session or a reverse tunnel back to some command and controlled access. And so if I wanted to be a bad guy, I could be a very bad person very, very quickly to an open device. And then that device goes back with you into the network, that device goes back with you into your environment, and then it becomes the jumping point that I can then elicit whatever my next steps are, which is usually lateralization, reconnaissance, and expansion and escalation of privilege. So short story is, lock your laptops. When you walk away, hit Windows key L. It's so simple. Windows key L
Right.
locks
Yeah.
it. As long as you're on Windows. If you're on Linux, good for you, but also
Yeah.
it's not going to work that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's Windows key and L, the Windows key and the L, and Matt, for those who haven't seen it, he goes around and it's kind of the wall of shame of laptops at airports. Just people, I'm amazed by that. When you see them they'll just
Yeah.
leave them at a charging
Security
station.
conferences. At
Yeah,
security conferences, even
yeah,
like executives in our world. Yeah, it is one of those things you don't think about. And that's the point where, even though I say there's insecure by default, insecure by design, and some of this isn't your fault, there is some of it where we just haven't really considered or understood the risk. And I'll give you another story, because I love to tell stories. But if you were looking at a skyscraper in the 1800s and it was 14 stories, it was beautiful brick, it was the nicest thing you'd ever seen in your town, and you're sitting there and see a fire on the 14th story, and you see a gentleman at the window knowing that the fire's behind him and the ground's in front of him, and that's the only
mm,
options he has. There's not fire trucks, there's no ladders, there's not, giant ways to save. Maybe we put out a trampoline, but you as a human watching that almost instantly know that that person is going to die. And if you
mm,
came to a position where someone said, hey, maybe we need to add this expense of putting a steel like set of staircases outside everybody's window they can crawl out into and then like walk down, let's make that a regulation. That's going to kill the price of business. We could never do business. We're not going to. No, nobody says that, because they just watch some dude splat on a dirt road off of a 14-story window. And
mm,
so it's not hard. It's guttural. We get it. But when you start talking about cyber and locking a computer, there isn't this direct guttural understanding of what that could lead to. And it's only after
yeah,
the incident, when I've watched that devastation happen and you see that pain, you see that outcome of, well, I got to feed my family and I've got to pay my employees. I can't help you. I'm
yeah,
waiting 4 more weeks for the insurance company to give me the forensics and say we're clean, that we can come back to this. Like, sometimes the watching that pain, I've never met a company that doesn't move forward in cybersecurity after that incident, period.
yeah,
And I think that's that kind of a separation that causes us challenge in cyber to get buy-in from our clients and partners to do things that are sometimes inconvenient to add security capabilities to business. Is they just don't, they think it's too inconvenient to hit Windows key L and then
yeah.
walk away. Yeah,
It's invisible, and there is that balance between security and convenience that's
100% always.
taken into effect. So we're just about at the top of the hour right now. Do you have any one last word word of wisdom from you, or anything
I,
that you see like, gee, I just wish people would do this because it would help? Any
I,
any
I
parting
wish
thoughts?
I wish I had a doctor after my name. Then I'd be as awesome as Ann. No, I tease. I would just say, partner and partner deeply, right? If you hire Ann and team, lean in, have the conversations, think what their advice is. How do I shift and change? How can I be more secure? Lean in, understand that it is a partnership. So I would say everyone could do better by talking and learning. But I'd also say, in less than a minute, I hope, I'd also say that there's no other profession that you pay like an Ann, that you also ask them to prove to you and teach you every piece of it. You don't go to your attorney and say, I appreciate you saying that I need to not fight this case because I'm going to lose.
Mm,
Do you mind teaching me precedents and precedents law from 1860 to 1975 under the current era of court doctrine? And then could you teach me how you're going to make sure that that's no, you trust them and pay them the $350 for the 12 minutes you sat there, right? And so you don't do that. Your doctor, you don't say, oh, really? You think I need lisinopril because of my high blood pressure? I want you to teach me about vascular pressure and how that vascular disease plays out over the next 5 years. And you need to show me the peptide. Nope, you'd start trusting. And so I would say, as you continue to watch your MSPs and your partners mature and get better at these cyber things and understand that this is, just like I showed in that first graphic, a very rapid onset problem we're all dealing with,
mm.
lean in. have a conversation, be part of the equation. That'd be the piece I'd leave it with. So thank you.
All
That's
right.
great.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Matt. I always love your positive energy and your willingness
Thank you.
to raise the tide for everybody.
It's awesome to be here. And genuinely, Anna, I love everything you do. It's great getting to work with you on a daily basis. So
Great.
appreciate you.
Thank you. And thank you, Nancy,
Thank
for
you.
reaching out to our community and getting so much involvement. So
Thanks,
Absolutely.
thanks,
Nancy.
everybody, for
Nice to
showing
meet
up.
you.
And we did record this. So, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.